No, I'm not in my normal studio, but there has been a really interesting Mac event today. Hello and welcome back to Mark Ellis Reviews, and thank you for subscribing if you have, and if you haven't subscribed, the button is just down there. Now, I am not in my usual studio. The reason for that is I'm on business, traveling at the moment. I'm actually in Canada, but I still want to talk to you about this event because it's been so hotly anticipated. I've talked about how much I want the new MacBook Pros and what I want to see with the Mac Mini, etc. And well, the event didn't completely satisfy everything I was looking for, but there's quite a lot to talk about, so let's just get into it. Now, I am going to focus this video on the Mac. I'm sorry, the MacBook and the new chips is the things that I'm interested in, and possibly the things that you're interested in. But there were a couple of other announcements. Firstly, there was a big thing not a big thing actually, there was a thing about Apple Music presented by Zane Lowe. I don't think we've seen Zane Lowe before on an Apple event. Quite nice to see that guy. I don't know him, sorry. It's been a long day. I know of Zane Lowe from his Radio 1 days in the UK. It's just nice to see he's still there. I don't know if he still had his job or not. Clearly he still has. But he was telling us about this brand new Apple Music tier that is called the Voice Plan. I couldn't quite get my head around that. It might be because I've been traveling all day, but it's basically $4.99 a month, and for that you basically get one person, works across all Apple devices. You don't get any spatial audio or lossless. It has just loads of playlists, and I think the idea being that you have to use your voice to access this version or this tier of Apple Music. Next thing was the HomePod Mini. They've painted it some different colours. AirPods, new AirPods, finally. Now, basically, the AirPods they released today are basically AirPods Pro, but without the kind of rubber tip things, and that's about it, really. So they are the 3rd gen AirPods, brand new low distortion drivers. I think they're probably the same sort of drivers that you get in the AirPods Pro, to be fair. Sweat and water resistant, adaptive EQ, MagSafe, wireless. They're basically AirPods Pro without the rubber tips, and probably with some of the stuff missing, but not much actually. And for $179, you can order them today. That's not bad at all. So onto Apple Silicon, and this is what we thought was coming, but the names of things are a bit different to what we were thinking. M1X isn't a thing. Instead, we've got 2 chips. We've got the M1 Pro and the M1 Max. Now, interestingly, they did confirm that we're now 1 year into the 2-year transition to Apple Silicon across the board. So now, where are we? So it's October 2021. So this time next year, it should be completely Apple Silicon everywhere. Now, I am going to have to refer to my notes on this because there were so many numbers thrown at us today. I'll get some of these wrong, and I will in future videos unpack this a bit more, but just let's go through the basics. So the first chip, which is the M1 Pro. Now, the M1 Pro offers 200 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. That's 3 times the amount the M1 can perform, twice the number of transistors as the M1, and it does all this with a 10-core CPU, which has 8 high-performance cores and 2 low-power efficiency cores. And apparently this thing can give up to 70% more performance than the M1. There's a 16-core GPU, which from a graphics perspective and someone like me who edits videos is very exciting. And they've got a new thing called the Media Engine, which is basically a form of acceleration for video, basically, and that includes ProRes acceleration. And it's what we've been waiting for, really. My M1 Mac Mini, which is the 16 gig version and the version that I do all of these video edits on, is starting to not creak at the seams, but I just feel like I'm pushing it a little bit. So to hear that there is this new M1 Pro chip on the way, or nearly here actually, which has more GPU cores, that is quite exciting. And it can also handle up to 32 gig of RAM, so we get past that 8 or 16 thing. The M1 Pro will have up to 32 gig of RAM, and that will satisfy a lot of people who still want that additional memory headroom, if you like. But they didn't stop there, no. So the M1X isn't a thing, the M1 Pro is a thing. Also a thing is the M1 Max. This is where it gets a bit bonkers. So the M1 Max doubles the memory bandwidth again to 400 gigabytes per second, twice the memory bandwidth of the M1 Pro. It's got 1.7 times more transistors than the M1 Pro and loads more than the original M1. And it's got a 32-core GPU, which is 4 times faster graphics performance than the M1. And then they really started digging into the power efficiency. And what was really interesting throughout this entire presentation was how much they were leaning on the battery life that these new M chips can offer. And we know that's been the case. So with the M1, it's just game-changing in terms of what you can get out of it in terms of battery performance for the M1 MacBook Air and the M1 MacBook Pro. I think the worry I had a little bit was that these brand new kind of pro level M chips would be very, very fast, very, 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 very performant and all that sort of stuff, but probably at the sacrifice of battery life. It doesn't sound like that's the case. We'll get to why in a bit when we get to the new MacBook Pros, but it sounds like they've somehow managed to retain that efficiency, the battery efficiency, and just push the performance into the stratosphere. They then did the inevitable and started comparing the M1 Max and the M1 Pro against the PC competition. And it was quite interesting because they showed loads of graphs. I won't go into the details because I don't really understand them. You probably aren't watching my channel for that particular information. They showed all these graphs with lots of numbers going up, and the M1 Pro and the M1 Max would just disappear again into the stratosphere, and these little PCs, the little Windows-based computers would be kind of like quivering at the bottom. Okay, flexing your muscles, Apple, that's fine. We get it. They're very, very fast consumer laptops / professional laptops, and they just blow the PC competition out of the water. But what was then very interesting was they provided a graph, which you don't see very often from Apple, which showed a very high-performance laptop, Windows laptop, which they didn't name, obviously, but they said they picked one of the most high-performance on the market. And that was actually beating the M1 Pro, or was it the M1 Max? I think it might have been the M1 Max in terms of performance, it was just pipping it. But the point Apple were making was that even though the M chip was a little bit, not quite as powerful as that very high performance Windows GPU and CPU, it was actually doing not that much less at 70% less power. Let me make sure I've got that right. Might not have been 70%, but it was basically using less power. And their point again is that if you are a professional, you can take out these new MacBooks and not really worry too much about battery life. Whereas if you took out that great big PC Windows-based laptop, then it's going to run out of juice pretty quickly. Now, does this matter? I don't know. I think a lot of these people, a lot of pros anyway, who are going to have these new MacBooks are going to have them plugged into power most of the time. Are you one of those pros? Does it bother you? If so, let me know in the comments. So onto the MacBook Pro. Now, I want a 16-inch MacBook Pro. I used to have the Intel version and it was just too noisy, and then the M1 came along and I sold mine basically. They have brought out that 16-inch version and the 14-inch version that was rumoured. They say that these new MacBooks were designed with performance and utility in mind, and they look fascinating. The product shots they showed, they almost look like MacBook Pros from 6 or 7 years ago. And the reason for that is they look a bit thicker. I don't know if they are. I need to look into these details. I'm not sure if they are thicker than the current version, but they just look a bit chunkier. And the key thing is they have HDMI. I'm really surprised by that. It looks like I think it's a full-size HDMI port. MagSafe, and it's not some newfangled type of MagSafe. It looks pretty much like the old MagSafe that was there before. An SD card slot and 3 Thunderbolt 4 ports. And it just looks, at certain angles, like an older MacBook. I don't mind that at all, actually. And there were other angles where it looked a bit more squared off and what have you. But what brings it all alive is this new screen. Basically, they're pretty much the same screen they've put into the M1 iPad Pro. It's got 24% thinner bezels. It's got a notch, but it doesn't have Face ID. The notch is just there to make the screen as big as possible. There's no Face ID unlocking on these new MacBook Pros, which is a bit of a shame. Key thing is it's got ProMotion, so it's got the up to 120 Hz refresh rate, which again is fantastic. And if you are a video editor, for example, you can turn it down to whatever refresh rate is best for your video editing needs. But to have ProMotion on a MacBook Pro, that's really exciting. Very bright, 1600 nits of peak brightness and 1000 nits of sustained brightness. It looks fantastic. And the sizes of these screens, although they are technically a bit bigger than the laptops they're replacing, the actual design of the laptop itself, of the MacBook Pro, is pretty much the same footprint. So you're not having to have a bigger device really, but you're getting that lovely, much bigger screen as a result. Camera is now 1080p. That's great. I think it's probably the same camera system they have put into the 24-inch iMac, which I've used an awful lot, and it is a really good webcam, to the point where when you're on calls, people often say, wow, what webcam are you using? So if it is pretty much the same webcam that is in the 24-inch M1 iMac, then that's a fantastic thing, and long overdue. Speakers and mic have had quite a big update, apparently. I think there's 6 speakers in both of the laptops. They both support spatial audio. Mics have been improved, lower noise floor, all that sort of stuff. I don't get that excited about the mics and the the speakers on MacBook Pros. So what else? The performance. They went through, again, I'm going to dig into this more in future videos, but I'll put some of the stuff on the screen now. Put it this way, these 16-inch and 14-inch versions of the new MacBook Pro are much quicker than the Intel versions they're replacing. We expected that, but the numbers are pretty impressive. You know, you're looking at 2 times better CPU performance on the 16-inch, you know, ridiculously quicker than the Intel versions they're replacing. And again, a big play on battery life. So they went into a bit more detail on the battery life for these new MacBook Pros. So the 14-inch can have up to 17 hours of video playback. The 16-inch can have up to 21 hours of video playback, which is incredible. Now the prices are pretty much what they were before. So these aren't cheap laptops. I just out of interest spec'd up the full Monty with the 16-inch, and it comes to nearly £6,000 in the UK if you spec it up with the M1 Max and 64 gig of memory, and it gets a bit silly. So out of curiosity, I looked at what the spec would be that I'd go for, and 16-inch M1 Pro, 32 gig of RAM, 1 terabyte, just under £3,000 in the UK. That's not bad. I don't think I'd need the M1 Max. I think as much as I do a lot of video editing, I work with 4K, I don't work with 8K video. The fact that I can get by pretty much with an M1 with 16 gig of RAM, I think going up to the M1 Pro with, let's say, 32 gig of RAM is going to be a huge upgrade for me personally. So these aren't cheap laptops, but MacBook Pros never have been. And generally, if you're a pro, if you're running a business or it's your livelihood, then it's an investment in that business. I can't wait to get my hands on them. It's going to be a chance for me to move everything over to a brand new Mac again, which I enjoy doing. One thing I will look forward to doing is moving my brand new password manager, which is 1Password, who are very, very kindly sponsoring this video. I mentioned a little while ago on a blog that I wrote that I was gradually transferring from iCloud Keychain to 1Password just to see what all the fuss was about with 1Password. I hadn't used it for many years. I wanted to get back into it. I've made that transition now. I'm now a full 1Password user, and I am at some point going to report back on how it's been. And it'll be interesting to see how easy it makes the transition from my M1 Mac Mini to a new MacBook Pro. If you've never used 1Password before, I've popped a link in the description so you can go and check them out. And yeah, thank you very much to the guys at 1Password for sponsoring this video. I'm going to stop there, guys, because it's, again, I've been traveling all day and I'm going to start rambling. But that was my initial, complete off-the-cuff reaction to today's big event. There was no Mac Mini, which was a shame. There was no big 27-inch replacement iMac, which I predicted. I think the MacBook Pros, very pleased with what they've done with those. I'm very excited to get my hands on them. And lastly, I forgot to mention this earlier, they've got rid of the touch bar, which we thought they'd do. So a lot of this has been backtracking on Apple's part. You know, no touch bar, SD card reader's back, the old MagSafe is back, but they clearly listen to their critics, and a lot of those critics, an awful lot of them, are pro users. And I think most of those pro users are going to be pretty happy with what they've seen today. But I'm interested to know what you thought about this event, so let me know in the comments. Was this exciting? Was it a letdown? Get involved in the comments. Now, if you've still got some time, I've left a link at the end of this video to my recent review of the brilliant iPhone 13 mini, which has become my favorite ever iPhone. So if you want to find out why, keep watching for a link to that video. But lastly, guys, thank you so much for watching this. I know it's been a different one. Like I say, my off-the-cuff reaction. Let me know yours in the comments, and I will see you in the normal surroundings on the next video.